I am Elise. I am 31 years old, and until last Thanksgiving, I was considered the ultimate disappointment of my prestigious Atlanta family. My brother smirked across the family dinner table and told me I did not deserve to carry our last name. My mother nodded in agreement. My father stared at his plate. Everyone waited for me to fall apart. Then my grandfather slowly stood up and announced that I would carry his name and everything that came with it. My brother's smile vanished instantly. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Buckhead meant upholding an image of flawless excellence. My parents, Harrison and Vivian, cared about their country club reputation more than they cared about their own daughter. The Thanksgiving dinner at our family estate was meant to be a showcase of our wealth and status. Crystal glasses caught the light from the massive chandeliers. A catered feast covered the long mahogany table. I sat at the far end feeling like a stranger in my own home. My sister-in-law Savannah sat diagonally across from me. Savannah was a white woman from an old money family who loved using passive-aggressive comments to assert her dominance over me. She reached across the table for the cranberry sauce. As she pulled her arm back, her elbow deliberately clipped my wine glass. The dark red liquid splashed directly onto my lap, soaking into my dress. "Oh my gosh, I am so clumsy!" Savannah gasped loudly, pressing a manicured hand to her chest. Her tone held zero genuine remorse. "I am so sorry, Elise. I completely forgot you are not used to wearing designer clothes. That dress looks like it came off a discount rack anyway. I am sure it will only take a month of your minimum wage salary to replace it." I calmly grabbed a linen napkin and dabbed at the stain. My brother Julian chuckled from the head of the table. Julian was 34, the golden child who ran the family logistics company. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He tossed it down the long table. It slid to a stop right next to my ruined dress. "That is the catering bill for tonight," Julian announced, his voice dripping with arrogance. $5,000. Since you live rent-free in our family shadow, the least you can do is pay for the dinner. Consider it a tax for your existence. Losers need to learn how to compensate successful people. I stared at the bill. $5,000 for a dinner I barely ate. I looked at my mother, expecting her to intervene. Instead, Vivian wiped her mouth elegantly and glared at me. "Do not ruin the holiday for your brother," Vivian snapped. "Savannah is right. If you had not thrown your life away and dropped out of your Master of Business Administration program 5 years ago, you would have the money to pay for this. You embarrass us every time you walk into this house. You should be grateful Julian even allows you to sit at his table." The injustice of her words burned my chest. I did not drop out because I was lazy. I looked directly at my mother, my voice steady and cold. I dropped out because Julian drained my entire college trust fund to pay off the lawyers for his drunk driving cover-up. The dining room went completely silent. Savannah dropped her fork. Julian shifted uncomfortably, his face flushing red. My father Harrison finally looked up from his plate, his eyes flashing with warning. "We agreed never to speak of that," Harrison growled. "Julian is the heir to this family. He carries the weight of our legacy. You are just a girl who will eventually marry and change her name. You were supposed to sacrifice for your brother." I reached into my clutch and pulled out a solid metal black credit card. I tossed it onto the $5,000 invoice. "Charge it," I said smoothly. "Keep the change, Julian. You are going to need it to pay your warehouse employees this month since your payroll account is currently overdrawn." Julian turned pale. "How did you know about the payroll?" he stammered. Before I could answer, a sudden movement drew everyone's attention to the corner of the room. My grandfather Langston sat in his wheelchair. For 3 years, my family treated him like a burden because they believed he suffered from severe dementia. They ignored him, talked over him, and openly discussed plundering his assets right in front of him. Grandpa Langston slowly placed his hands on the armrests of his wheelchair. With a deliberate, powerful motion, he pushed himself up. He stood completely straight, his eyes sharp and alert. The frail, confused old man vanished in an instant. Julian dropped his wine glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor. You are not sick, Julian whispered, his voice trembling. I have not been sick a day in my life, Langston declared, his baritone voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I sat in that chair and played the fool, so I could see exactly who the vultures in this family really were. I watched you, Harrison, excuse your son's crimes. I watched you, Vivian, enable his greed. I watched Savannah insult my own flesh and blood. Julian just told Elise she does not deserve to carry this family name, Langston said, glaring at my brother. So she will carry mine and everything that comes with it. Suddenly, Harrison lunged across the table. He snatched the legal folder from Langston's hands and threw the document directly into the roaring fireplace behind him. You get absolutely nothing, Elise. Get out of here before I make you pay for everything today. The smell of burning parchment filled the dining room as the legal document turned to ash in the fireplace. But the real horror was the sudden sharp gasp that tore from my grandfather's throat. His hands flew to his chest, and his eyes rolled back as his heavy frame slipped from the wheelchair and crashed heavily onto the hardwood floor. Panic erupted, but not for the dying patriarch. As I dropped to my knees and immediately began chest compressions, Savannah let out a theatrical, piercing shriek. She threw herself onto the nearest velvet sofa, clutching her pearl necklace and sobbing loudly that her anxiety was acting up. She cried that she was having a severe panic attack because the energy in the room was just too aggressive for her to handle. My mother and father instantly rushed to Savannah's side. They rubbed her shoulders and offered her sparkling water, completely ignoring the 85-year-old man fighting for his life on the floor just feet away. I pushed down on my grandfather's chest, shouting for someone to call an ambulance, but my brother Julian was too busy pouring himself a fresh glass of bourbon. He watched me sweat with a look of absolute disgust on his face. I kept the rhythm going, pushing past the burning exhaustion in my arms, praying the paramedics would arrive before the only person who ever truly loved me took his last breath. The sterile, blinding lights of the hospital waiting room offered no comfort. 2 agonizing hours had passed since they wheeled my grandfather through the double doors of the intensive care unit. I stood alone by the coffee vending machine. My designer dress was still stained with Savannah's spilled red wine and my grandfather's sweat. The sharp sound of clicking heels broke the heavy silence of the corridor. My mother Vivian marched down the hallway with her luxury handbag swinging aggressively at her side. She did not ask how I was holding up. She did not ask if there was any news from the cardiac surgeons. She marched right up to me and physically blocked the pathway that led to the intensive care unit doors. She reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of hastily stapled legal papers, shoving a pen hard against my chest. "Sign it," she demanded. Her voice was a venomous whisper meant to keep the passing nurses from hearing. I looked down at the bold print on the page. It was a waiver of inheritance, which was a complete and total renunciation of any claim to the Langston estate. My mother's eyes were cold and unyielding. "You caused this," she hissed at me. "You came into our house to disrespect your brother, and you gave your grandfather a heart attack with your greedy little stunt. Sign this paper right now and walk away, or you are no longer my daughter." The sheer audacity of her demand made my blood boil. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me and wondered how her heart had become so hollow over the years. "You are blaming me for a heart attack that happened because Dad burned his legal documents?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. My mother stepped closer until she was entirely in my personal space. Her perfectly manicured finger jabbed painfully into my collarbone. "You always ruin everything, Elise. You have been a selfish burden since you were a teenager. Just like when you ruined Julian's high school graduation party by ending up in the emergency room, making the whole community gossip about us." "I did not ruin his graduation, Mom," I fired back, refusing to shrink away from her. "I was in the emergency room because your precious golden boy drove drunk, wrapped his sports car around a telephone pole, and left me bleeding in the passenger seat while he ran away into the woods to avoid a breathalyzer test. You paid the police chief to lose the report, and you left me alone in a hospital bed with a broken collarbone, while you took Julian out for a celebratory steak dinner to make him feel better." My mother slapped me across the face. The sharp crack echoed down the empty hospital corridor, but I did not even flinch. I just stared at her, absorbing the sting and feeling the last remaining thread of my familial loyalty snap and wither away completely. Before she could raise her hand to strike me again, Julian strolled down the hallway flanked by two massive hospital security guards. He looked incredibly pleased with himself, waving a blue clipboard in the air like a championship trophy. "I see you are still refusing to fall in line," Julian sneered as he stepped between me and the intensive care unit doors. "Well, it does not matter anymore because you are out of time." He tapped the clipboard against his palm. "Grandpa had his lawyers draft up a medical power of attorney last year, when we all thought he was losing his mind. Guess whose name is on it?" He smiled a wicked, triumphant smile. "Mine. I make the medical decisions now. I decide who gets to see him, and who gets to talk to his doctors, and who gets thrown out like the trash they are." He turned to the security guards and pointed a finger directly at my face. "This woman is estranged and is causing my family severe emotional distress. Remove her from the premises immediately. If she tries to come back, have her arrested for trespassing." The guards stepped forward with their hands resting heavily on their utility belts. My mother crossed her arms, a look of ultimate satisfaction settling over her features as she watched her golden boy assert his dominance. They waited for the tears. They waited for me to beg or scream or completely unravel in the middle of the hospital lobby. They wanted to see me broken. But I did not shed a single tear. I calmly smoothed down the front of my ruined dress, looking Julian dead in the eye. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I dialed a direct private line to my chief financial officer, never breaking eye contact with my brother. The line connected immediately. "Execute Order 66 on the Julian accounts," I said softly into the receiver, and then hung up. Julian scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes at the security guards. "Look at her trying to act tough with her fake little phone calls," he mocked, adjusting his expensive suit jacket. But his laughter was cut completely short. His own cell phone began to vibrate violently in his pocket. He pulled it out and his face dropped as he read the caller identification. It was his chief operating officer. Julian answered the call on speakerphone. His arrogant smirk melted into absolute terror as the frantic voice echoed through the quiet hospital hallway. "Julian," the executive voice screamed in sheer panic. "Every single corporate credit card just declined. Our vendors are locking the supply gates. The bank just froze all our operating accounts worldwide. We are completely locked out of everything." The morning sun filtered through the blinds of my apartment, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. I had barely slept after leaving the hospital, but my mind was completely clear and focused on the next step of my plan. My phone vibrated endlessly on the kitchen counter with notifications from my financial team. They were sending me detailed reports confirming that Julian was now entirely locked out of his corporate accounts. His logistics company was paralyzed, and his personal assets were frozen, pending the debt collection protocols I had activated. I was just pouring my first cup of black coffee when a sharp, entitled knock echoed through my living room. I set my mug down and opened the front door to find Savannah standing in the hallway. She wore a pristine white tennis skirt and an oversized cashmere sweater, acting as if she were stepping into a toxic biohazard zone. She pushed past me without waiting for an invitation and began inspecting my modest apartment with a look of profound pity and disgust. She sighed heavily, dropping her heavy designer leather tote bag onto my sofa. "Elise, we really need to have a serious conversation," she began, her voice dripping with fake sisterly concern. "You caused quite a massive scene at the hospital last night, and the family is deeply embarrassed by your behavior. You are always so aggressive and loud, Elise. It is really not a good look for a black woman trying to survive in a city like this. People talk, and your attitude is just making things unnecessarily difficult for everyone." I leaned against the kitchen counter, sipping my coffee in absolute silence. I let her speak, knowing that every single word coming out of her mouth was just digging her grave deeper. Savannah paced across my living room rug, waving her manicured hands dramatically as she lectured me. "Julian is under a tremendous amount of stress right now," she continued, pacing back and forth. "He is carrying the entire Langston family legacy on his shoulders, and he needs to focus on his business. You need to calm down and just give Julian the estate. He actually knows how to handle money and build wealth. You clearly do not know how to manage anything." She gestured dismissively at my simple furniture and bare walls. She reached into her expensive tote bag and pulled out a sleek leather checkbook. She clicked a gold pen and scribbled a number on the paper, tearing the slip out and holding it toward me like I was a beggar on the street. "I am writing you a check for $10,000, she announced proudly, tilting her chin up. "Consider it a generous gift from us. You can use it to pay off your little debts, or buy some clothes that actually fit you properly. Maybe you can even use it to re-enroll in a community college and get your life back on track. Julian and I are doing incredibly well right now. My new luxury wellness spa downtown is fully booked for the next 6 months, and the profits are astronomical. I can afford to be generous to the less fortunate members of the family, so just take the money and walk away from Grandpa Langston." I looked at the check fluttering in her fingers. I walked over and calmly took it from her hand. Savannah smiled a smug, triumphant smile, assuming I had finally submitted to her wealth and overwhelming white privilege. Without breaking eye contact or saying a single word, I walked over to the heavy-duty paper shredder sitting next to my home office desk. I pressed the power button and fed her $10,000 check directly into the machine. The loud grinding noise filled the quiet apartment, as her arrogant bribe was instantly turned into worthless shredded confetti. Savannah gasped loudly, her mouth dropping open in pure shock. "Are you crazy?" she shrieked, taking a step toward me. "Do you have any idea how hard it is to make that kind of money?" I completely ignored her outrage. I calmly opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick, heavy legal folder. I walked back over and dropped the folder onto the coffee table right in front of her knees. "I do not need your charity, Savannah," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm register. "I have been very busy while you and Julian were playing pretend billionaires. When I told you I bought your husband's debt, I meant every single penny of it." Savannah stared at the folder, her fake tan suddenly looking a bit pale. "What are you talking about?" She stammered, her confidence beginning to crack. I tapped the cover of the folder with my index finger. Julian took out massive illegal loans to cover the $40 million he lost in offshore gambling over the past 5 years. But the bank needed substantial collateral to approve those loans. Do you know what he put up as collateral, Savannah? He put up the commercial real estate building in downtown Atlanta. The exact same prime real estate building where your luxury wellness spa is currently operating. Since I executed the hostile takeover on his accounts last night, Julian officially defaulted on his massive loans. I pulled a single sheet of paper from the folder and held it out to her. Savannah's eyes darted frantically across the dense legal jargon printed on the page. "As the primary debt holder, my financial firm seized the collateral at 8 o'clock this morning," I explained, watching the color completely drain from her face. "I am now the sole legal owner of that entire commercial building. Julian was letting you run your little wellness spa rent-free for the past year to help you build your business. Under corporate real estate law, that constitutes unpaid phantom rent. Since you have no legal lease agreement and you technically owe me 12 months of back rent, I am exercising my absolute right as the new property owner." I shoved the paper directly against her chest, forcing her to take it. "That is a 24-hour eviction notice," I stated coldly. "You have until tomorrow morning to pack up your expensive massage tables and your essential oils and completely vacate my property. If there is a single towel left inside that building by noon tomorrow, I am having my private security team throw it all into a dumpster out on the street." Savannah looked at the eviction notice in her trembling hands and then looked up at me. Her mask of Southern charm and arrogant privilege completely shattered into a million pieces. The composed, wealthy housewife vanished and was instantly replaced by a cornered rabid animal. "You cannot do this to me!" she screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch. "I built that spa from nothing. It belongs to me and my family. You have no right to take my business." She crumpled the eviction notice in her fist and let out a guttural scream of absolute unhinged rage. She lunged forward, swinging her arm with all her strength, aiming a vicious open-handed slap directly at my face. But she was sloppy and blinded by her own fury. I simply took a calm, calculated step backward. Savannah swung at empty air. Her own aggressive momentum carried her violently forward. Her designer high heels tangled in the thick edge of my living room rug. She pitched forward wildly, losing all balance. Her face crashed directly into the sharp, solid corner of my heavy oak coffee table. A sickening crunch echoed through the apartment as bone met wood. Savannah collapsed onto the hardwood floor, clutching her face as dark red blood began pouring through her fingers and dripping onto my rug. She rolled onto her back, sobbing hysterically and writhing in pain. "You assaulted me," she screamed through the blood pouring from her broken nose. "I am calling the cops, Elise. I am calling the police right now, and I am going to tell them you attacked me, and you are going to prison for assault." Savannah stayed on my living room floor, smearing the blood across her cheeks to make the injury look as gruesome as possible. She wailed loudly, clutching her face and rocking back and forth, until the heavy knock of the police echoed through my front door. 2 officers entered my apartment, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. The moment they stepped inside, Savannah unleashed the performance of a lifetime. The weaponization of her white tears was flawless. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at me, sobbing that I had lost my mind. She told the officers she came over to bring me a generous financial gift because our family was worried about my living conditions, and out of nowhere I snapped. She used all the right words to trigger their biases. She called me aggressive, hostile, and dangerously unpredictable. She painted the perfect picture of an unhinged, angry black woman attacking a helpless, generous white woman who was only trying to offer charity. I watched the shift in the officer's posture immediately. The older officer stepped toward me, his face hardened with assumption. He ordered me to turn around and place my hands behind my back, telling me I was being placed under arrest for aggravated assault. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue or give them any reason to validate Savannah's calculated narrative. I simply kept my hands in plain sight and told the officers I would gladly comply with whatever they needed, but I asked them to look at the television screen first. I pointed to a small decorative owl sitting on my bookshelf. I explained it was not a decoration, but a hidden high-definition security camera that recorded audio and video 24 hours a day. Savannah's theatrical sobbing abruptly hitched in her throat. The color drained from what little of her face was not covered in blood. I pulled out my phone and synced the camera's footage directly to my large smart television. I pressed play and let the truth fill the room. The crisp, clear video showed Savannah standing in my living room delivering her racist microaggressions. It captured her attempting to hand me the bribe. It showed me calmly shredding the check and handing her the eviction notice. Then the video clearly displayed Savannah screaming in absolute unhinged rage. The officers watched in stunned silence as the screen showed Savannah lunging to slap me, tripping over the edge of my rug and smashing her own face into my heavy oak coffee table while I simply stepped out of her way. The video ended with Savannah rolling on the floor, explicitly threatening to call the cops and frame me for assault. The apartment was dead silent. I turned off the television and looked at the 2 officers. The older officer slowly took his hand off his handcuffs and turned his stern gaze down toward Savannah, who was now sitting frozen on the floor. He informed her that filing a false police report was a serious crime, and attempting to frame an innocent person for a felony meant she was the one leaving in handcuffs. Savannah panicked. She dropped the victim act entirely and began shrieking for her husband. She screamed Julian's name, clawing at the floor and begging the officers not to take her to jail because she was a high society business owner and could not be seen in the back of a squad car. Just as the officer reached down to pull her up by her arms, the front door swung open. Julian burst into the apartment out of breath and completely frantic. He took in the scene of his bleeding wife, the 2 police officers, and my completely calm demeanor. Julian immediately tried to use his family name and influence to control the narrative, but the officers were not having it. They told Julian his wife was being arrested for a false report, and the only way she would avoid spending the night in a jail cell was if I declined to press charges for trespassing and property damage. Julian looked at me with sheer hatred in his eyes, but he had no leverage. He was completely trapped. I looked at the blood staining my expensive vintage rug and the chipped edge of my custom coffee table. I told Julian I would not press charges if he compensated me for the damages immediately. I demanded a cashier's check for $20,000 to replace my ruined belongings and cover the cleaning costs. Julian's jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might shatter. But looking at his wife cowering on the floor with a broken nose, he had no choice. He pulled out his personal checkbook and wrote me the funds on the spot, suffering the ultimate humiliation of paying me to save his wife from wearing a bright orange jumpsuit. The officers gave Savannah a harsh warning and ordered them both to leave my property immediately. Julian practically had to carry his sobbing wife toward the front door. I stood in the center of my living room holding the $20,000 check, feeling a brief wave of satisfaction. But just as Julian stepped over the threshold into the hallway, he stopped. He handed Savannah over to the building concierge and turned back to face me. The humiliation and panic on his face completely vanished. It was replaced by his signature arrogant smirk. "You really think you won today, Elise?" he sneered, his voice echoing in the quiet hall. "You think taking Savannah's little spa and getting a few $1,000s makes you a player in this game? You are nothing but a dropout trying to sit at the adults' table." He adjusted his tailored suit jacket and stepped closer to my door. "You had my corporate accounts frozen, but you forgot who I am. You forgot I had medical power of attorney before you threw your little hospital tantrum. While you were busy playing landlord and shredding checks this morning, I was busy handling the real money. I did not need my company accounts to bypass your freeze, Elise." Julian pulled out his phone and flashed a banking confirmation screen in my direction. "I just successfully transferred Grandpa Langston's $50 million offshore trust directly into my private logistics company accounts," he snarled. "The transfer cleared 10 minutes ago, and your little fintech firm cannot touch it because it is protected under international corporate law. You are completely finished, Elise. Enjoy your empty victory today, because tomorrow I am burying you." The morning sun glared off the glass facade of Julian's corporate headquarters. I parked my car across the street and watched the media vans lining the block. Julian had pulled out all the stops for his grand announcement. Banners hung from the marble columns proudly declaring a $50 million expansion for his logistics empire. He had positioned himself as the brilliant young visionary of Atlanta, bringing jobs and prosperity to the community. Walking into the main lobby, I blended in with the crowd of local politicians, eager investors, and overly dressed socialites. At the front of the room, my parents stood beaming with pride. Vivian wore a sickeningly sweet smile, while Harrison shook hands with board members. Savannah was there too, wearing a large pair of designer sunglasses to hide the bandages on her broken nose. The audacity of this family was staggering. They were celebrating a mirage built entirely on stolen money, and I was about to shatter the glass completely. I slipped past the catered champagne tables and made my way to the back of the conference hall, where the audio-visual team was set up. The young technician at the soundboard looked stressed, juggling multiple monitors. I stepped up beside him, sliding a crisp $100 bill and a black flash drive onto his console. I told him there was a last-minute change to the presentation straight from the chief executive officer. He barely looked up, just took the cash and plugged the drive into the main feed. I grabbed a spare wireless microphone from the table and waited in the shadows, listening to the murmurs of the wealthy elite, waiting to throw their money at my brother. On stage, Julian stepped up to the podium. The crowd erupted into applause. He soaked it in, raising his hands with fake humility. He spoke about his vision, his dedication to the family legacy, and his tireless work ethic. He claimed this $50 million expansion was the result of his brilliant strategic planning. It was a sickening performance. He thanked our parents for instilling him with integrity and discipline. I felt my stomach turn. I was standing up there acting like a savior while he had spent years treating me like the dirt beneath his expensive shoes. "Thank you all for believing in me," Julian said, his voice echoing through the massive speakers. "Now I want to show you exactly what the future of this company looks like. Please direct your attention to the screens." He gestured grandly toward the massive digital displays flanking the stage. The lights dimmed in the hall. The crowd hushed in excited anticipation. But instead of a slick corporate promotional video showing renderings of new warehouses, the screens flashed bright white. Gasps rippled through the audience. Spread across the massive displays were high-resolution images of bank statements, offshore account routing numbers, and wire transfer logs. The bold red numbers highlighted transactions moving millions of dollars from Langston family trusts directly into shell companies located in the Cayman Islands. Julian froze. His confident smile vanished instantly. He frantically signaled to the tech booth to cut the feed, but I stepped out from the shadows into the aisle. I turned on my microphone and my voice boomed through the hall, cutting through the rising panic of the investors. Julian did not secure a $50 million expansion, I announced, walking slowly down the center aisle toward the stage. The entire room turned to stare at me. My mother gasped loudly, covering her mouth in absolute horror. Harrison lunged forward, but security held him back. I kept my eyes locked on my brother. What you are looking at on those screens are not investments. I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. Those are wire transfers. Julian embezzled $50 million from our grandfather's private trust to cover the $40 million he lost in illegal offshore gambling over the last 5 years. The room erupted into absolute chaos. Reporters started shouting questions, snapping photographs of the bank statements on the screen. Investors were pulling out their phones, yelling at their assistants to sell their shares immediately. Julian gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning white. "Shut it off," he screamed into his own microphone. "She is lying to you. She is a disgruntled, estranged sister who is just trying to extort me." I walked right up to the front of the stage, looking up at his terrified face. "I am not lying, Julian," I said coldly. "And you are not a business genius. You are an addict who destroyed everything you touched. And the saddest part is that our parents knew everything all along." I turned and pointed at Harrison and Vivian, who were trying to shrink into the background to hide from the flashing cameras. "You two remortgaged the family mansion just to hide his gambling debts. You let everyone call me the disappointment and the college dropout, while you secretly poured millions into covering up his massive failures to protect his precious reputation. You sold out your own daughter to protect a thief." The media frenzy grew deafening. Flashbulbs blinded the room. Board members were storming out of the hall, demanding their money back from my father. I stood there, feeling the incredible weight of the last 5 years finally lifting off my shoulders. I had exposed him. I had ripped the mask off the golden child for the entire city to see. But as I watched Julian standing behind the podium, something strange happened. The sheer panic on his face slowly melted away. He let out a low, dark chuckle that amplified through the speakers. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit and slowly pulled out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it deliberately, holding it up for the cameras to see. "You really think you are smarter than me, Elise?" Julian sneered, looking down at me with absolute contempt. "You forgot one tiny detail. I am not a thief." He tapped the signature line on the document. "Grandpa Langston signed the authorization for me to use these exact funds yesterday while he was lying in that hospital bed. He gave me full control of the trust. It is fully legal." The massive screens behind Julian displayed the heavily magnified image of the authorization document. The reporters in the room instantly stopped shouting and aimed their camera lenses at the glowing digital projection. Julian stood tall at the podium, puffing out his chest with an air of total invincibility. He looked at me, expecting to see defeat washing over my face. He expected me to finally bow my head and surrender to his ultimate checkmate. I did not move a single inch. I kept my eyes locked on the massive screen, studying the harsh black ink of my grandfather's signature. It was perfect. The sweeping loops and the sharp angles of the letters were an exact match to the signature on every birthday card and legal contract he had ever signed in his life. It was a flawless execution of his handwriting, and that was exactly how I knew it was entirely fake. I raised the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the silent conference hall, carrying a razor-sharp edge. "That is a beautiful signature, Julian," I said, slowly stepping closer to the stage. "It is absolutely flawless. In fact, it is way too flawless. You see, ladies and gentlemen," I continued, turning to address the crowd of stunned investors and greedy board members. "My grandfather suffered a massive cardiac event yesterday, which triggered a severe stroke. He is currently lying in the intensive care unit on life support. The medical reports confirm that the stroke completely paralyzed the entire right side of his body." A collective gasp swept through the room. I turned back to look my brother dead in the eye. "Grandpa Langston is right-handed, Julian," I stated coldly. "It is physically and medically impossible for him to have gripped a pen, let alone sign a perfectly steady legal authorization, while completely paralyzed on his dominant side. You did not get his permission, Julian. You forged it." Julian's arrogant smirk faltered. The color rapidly drained from his face as the reality of my words set in. The media erupted into a frenzy of flashing lights and shouted questions. Board members began frantically whispering to their legal teams. I ignored all of them and turned my attention to the front row where my parents were standing frozen in terror. I looked at the two people who were supposed to protect me. My mother Vivian was trembling, clutching her designer handbag like it was a life preserver. My father Harrison refused to meet my gaze. I stepped right up to the edge of the stage, looming over them. How long did it take? I asked, my voice dropping into a deadly whisper that the microphone caught perfectly. How long did it take you to forge his name while he was lying there fighting for his life? Did you hold his limp hand and force the pen across the paper, or did you just practice tracing it in the hospital waiting room? Vivian burst into tears, burying her face in her hands. She could not take the pressure of the hundreds of eyes burning into her. "We had to do it, Elise," she sobbed hysterically, her voice carrying over the crowd. "We had to save him. The debt collectors were going to take everything. We could not let them ruin Julian." Harrison stepped in front of my mother, his face dark with defensive rage. He snatched the microphone from a nearby reporter and glared at me with absolute resentment. "We did what was necessary," he shouted, his voice booming with toxic authority. "Julian carries the family name Elise. He is the heir to the Langston Empire. We have to protect the blackmail legacy of this family at all costs. You are just a woman. You will marry some man and give your money and your loyalty to another family anyway. Julian is our bloodline. He needed that trust fund to survive, and I will not apologize for ensuring my son keeps his rightful place at the top." A wave of pure disgust washed over me. The sheer audacity of his deeply ingrained misogyny was suffocating. They had willingly committed a federal felony hovering over a dying man's bed, just to protect a worthless gambling addict, simply because he was born male. They looked at me, a self-made woman who had built my own massive wealth from nothing, and saw someone inherently less valuable than a failure in a tailored suit. I absorbed the horrific sting of my father's betrayal. I did not scream or cry. The last remaining shred of empathy I held for these people withered and died completely. I looked back up at Julian, who was desperately trying to compose himself behind the podium. He puffed out his chest, trying to regain control of the room. "It does not matter what she says," Julian shouted over the noise, pointing an accusing finger at me. "The signature is on the document and the transfer is already done. The money is in my accounts. You are too late, Elise." I smiled. It was a cold, chilling smile that made Julian physically flinch and take a step back from the podium. "You really do not know anything about finance, do you, Julian?" I asked softly into the microphone. "You cannot just fax a piece of paper to a private wealth management bank and expect them to move $50 million from a high-yield trust. Federal banking regulations require a strict verification protocol. Any transfer over $10 million requires verbal confirmation directly from the account holder on a recorded line. Since Grandpa cannot speak, you never got that verbal confirmation." Julian threw his head back and laughed loudly. It was a harsh, grating sound of pure desperation. "You think I am an idiot, Elise," he mocked, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "I know all about the verbal confirmation rule. That is exactly why I went straight to the bank manager. I made sure he understood the urgency of the situation. He manually bypassed the verbal protocol. He authorized the manual override himself. The money is mine. I won." The room held its breath, waiting for my reaction. I let the silence stretch for a few agonizing seconds, letting Julian bask in his imaginary victory. I took one final step toward the stage, locking my eyes onto his terrified, sweating face. "That is incredibly funny, Julian," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence like a blade. "Because I bought that private bank 3 weeks ago. I am the sole chief executive officer of the parent financial group that owns that branch. When your corrupt little bank manager tried to initiate a manual override on a $50 million trust account, it triggered a massive internal security alert." Julian's eyes widened in sheer horror. He looked down at his phone, frantically tapping the screen. "The transfer was never processed," Julian restated clearly, making sure every single reporter and investor in the room heard me. "It was flagged by my security team and completely blocked at 8 o'clock this morning. You did not get the $50 million. You got nothing. And your bank manager was fired and reported to the federal authorities an hour ago for attempting to facilitate massive corporate fraud. Julian dropped his phone. It clattered loudly against the wooden stage. He stood paralyzed behind the podium, his mouth opening and closing without making a sound, as the realization finally hit him. He had no money. He had no legacy. I was completely and utterly destroyed. Julian stood completely frozen on the stage, while the chaotic room swallowed him whole. The reporters swarmed the podium, flashing their cameras in his pale, defeated face, but I did not stay to watch him crumble. I turned my back on my family and walked out of the conference hall through the heavy double doors, leaving them to drown in the mess they created. I thought I had finally won, but I severely underestimated the sheer desperation of a wealthy white family backed into a corner. By the time I woke up the next morning, the narrative had been entirely rewritten. Savannah had called her father, who owned the largest media conglomerate in the state. She weaponized her family network to launch a brutal and heavily funded smear campaign against me. I turned on my television and saw my own face plastered across the morning news channel. The headline running across the bottom of the screen was printed in bold, aggressive letters. It read, "Scammer dropout steals from dying grandfather." The news anchors painted a horrific picture of me to their millions of viewers. They claimed I was an estranged, violent granddaughter who swooped in to financially abuse an 85-year-old man suffering from severe dementia. They completely erased Julian's embezzlement and replaced it with a highly fictionalized story where I hacked the private bank accounts to steal the family fortune. They showed heavily edited and manipulated clips of me walking out of the hospital looking cold and heartless. Savannah's family used every single media outlet they owned to spread the vicious lie that I was holding my grandfather hostage against his will and intentionally denying him proper medical care. The smear campaign was incredibly effective because it fed directly into every racial and class bias the city had to offer. I looked out my living room window and saw the immediate real-world consequences of their malicious lies. At least a dozen large news vans were parked illegally along my street, blocking traffic and creating a circus. Reporters with large cameras were swarming the entrance to my building, pushing heavy microphones into the faces of my neighbors as they tried to leave for work. A massive crowd of angry protesters had gathered on the sidewalk, holding handmade signs demanding justice for my grandfather. They were chanting my name and calling me a thief and an elder abuser. My phone began vibrating violently on the kitchen counter. I looked at the screen and saw a live broadcast of my mother, Vivian, sitting on a velvet sofa in a pristine television studio. She was wearing a conservative gray dress and dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a white tissue. She looked directly into the camera, putting on the most flawless and sickening performance of her entire life. Vivian begged me to stop holding the family hostage. She squeezed out fake tears and told the interviewer that her troubled, estranged daughter had always been deeply jealous of Julian and his success. She pleaded with me to let them see my grandfather so they could say a final goodbye before I completely drained his bank accounts and ruined his legacy. The level of pure evil it took to go on national television and cry fake tears while her own father lay in a hospital bed recovering from a stroke was beyond my comprehension. My corporate public relations team called me immediately, begging me to release a public statement to defend myself. They wanted me to go on a rival news network and show the actual bank records to clear my name. But I refused to give them the satisfaction of a public argument. I knew exactly how the media worked, and defending myself would only give their lies more oxygen. I instructed my team to remain completely silent. I did not issue a single press release or post a single word on social media. The silence drove the reporters outside my building absolutely crazy. They banged on the lobby doors demanding answers. But behind closed doors, I was moving with absolute precision and devastating force. I contacted my elite legal team and quietly filed a massive $200 million defamation lawsuit directly against the media conglomerate owned by Savannah's family. I did not just sue the news station. I personally sued Savannah, Julian, my parents, and every single executive board member who signed off on the slanderous broadcast. I attached the irrefutable banking logs, the hospital security footage, and the digital footprint of Julian's embezzlement to the confidential legal filings. I knew the lawsuit would completely bankrupt Savannah's entire family once it officially hit the courts. I sat on my sofa watching the angry protesters outside my window, feeling a cold sense of absolute calm wash over me. I had legally cornered all of them, and they had absolutely no idea what kind of financial ruin was coming for them. I was just reviewing the final legal filings on my laptop when a series of loud, aggressive bangs echoed through my apartment. It was not the polite knock of a neighbor or a delivery driver. It was the heavy, authoritative pounding of law enforcement. Before I could even stand up or walk toward the entryway, the thick wood of my front door splintered and crashed open with terrifying force. Three large, heavily armed police officers rushed into my living room with their hands resting on their weapons, shouting commands. They were followed closely by two stern-looking women wearing official state identification badges around their necks. The taller woman stepped forward aggressively and unrolled a thick stack of legal documents. She announced in a booming voice that she was from Adult Protective Services, and they were executing an emergency warrant to permanently remove Theodore Langston from my care. She looked at me with absolute contempt and stated they had received multiple credible reports that I was a severe danger to my grandfather, and they were taking him away from me immediately. Before I could even process the absolute audacity of the state workers barging into my home, Julian and Savannah strolled confidently through the broken doorway. They flanked the government officials like proud vultures circling a fresh kill. Savannah wore a fresh white bandage taped securely across the bridge of her broken nose, but that did not hide the vicious, triumphant grin stretching across her face. Julian adjusted the cuffs of his expensive tailored suit and looked around my living room with absolute disdain. He stepped right up to the Adult Protective Services supervisor and handed her a stack of hastily printed documents. He announced loudly that he had found a state-funded low-income nursing home on the outskirts of the city that was ready to take my grandfather immediately. Julian stated that since I was clearly unfit and currently facing a massive elder abuse investigation, he was executing his medical power of attorney to take full control of the old man. Savannah chimed in, wiping away a fake tear and telling the officers it was a tragedy that I had forced them to take such drastic measures. She claimed they had to protect the family patriarch from my violent and erratic behavior because I was clearly losing my grip on reality and posing a severe threat to his safety. The state workers looked at me with absolute disgust, preparing to push their way down the narrow hallway toward my guest bedroom. The lead supervisor demanded I step aside and let them collect the elderly victim so they could transport him safely to the facility. The armed police officers shifted their weight, ready to physically restrain me if I put up any resistance. I did not move a single muscle. I just crossed my arms and stared directly at my brother. I told Julian he was making a very serious mistake and that he should leave my apartment before he embarrassed himself any further. Julian just threw his head back and laughed, a loud, booming sound that echoed through my small apartment. He told me the game was over, and I had completely lost everything because the world now knew I was a manipulative scammer. But the arrogant laughter died in his throat, the exact moment my guest bedroom door clicked open. The heavy wooden door swung wide, and Grandpa Langston slowly rolled his wheelchair out into the main living area. He looked incredibly frail for a split second, sitting there in his plaid pajamas, with a thick woven blanket draped over his knees, and his head tilted slightly to the side. Julian immediately stepped forward, putting on a sickeningly sweet voice, treating our grandfather like a confused, helpless toddler. He crouched down and told the old man not to worry, because they were finally taking him away from me and putting him somewhere safe, where his mind could rest and he would be properly medicated. Grandpa Langston did not say a word at first. He just stared at Julian with a gaze so incredibly sharp and piercing, it made the Adult Protective Services workers physically take a cautious step back. The air in the room grew heavy and thick with an unnatural tension. Then the absolute unthinkable happened. My 85-year-old grandfather gripped the armrests of his wheelchair and pushed himself up. He did not struggle or shake or hesitate. He stood perfectly tall, his shoulders pulled back and his posture commanding the absolute unquestionable authority he had wielded for decades in the corporate world. He kicked the woven blanket off his legs and walked smoothly across the hardwood floor without a single trace of the severe limp or the paralysis he had been faking since his supposed stroke. Savannah gasped out loud, grabbing Julian's arm as if she had just witnessed a dead man rise from the grave. Julian froze, completely paralyzed by shock, as the man he thought was a brain-dead invalid marched directly up to the lead state investigator. Grandpa Langston reached inside his pajama pocket and pulled out a thick sealed envelope, handing it firmly to the bewildered woman. "I hired 3 independent board-certified psychiatrists a month ago," Grandpa Langston said, his voice booming with perfect crystal-clear enunciation. "I passed every single cognitive and neurological evaluation with flying colors. I am 100% lucid and completely legally competent to make all of my own personal and financial decisions." The state worker looked down at the official medical documents in her hands, her mouth hanging open in absolute shock as she read the official seals of approval from the top doctors in the state. The police officers immediately stepped back, realizing they had been weaponized in a fraudulent scheme. Grandpa Langston slowly turned his piercing gaze toward Julian, who was now trembling visibly. "I faked my cognitive decline, Julian," he stated coldly, watching his arrogant grandson squirm in absolute terror. "I faked the severity of my stroke and I faked the memory loss because I suspected you were the rat stealing from my company. I needed to see exactly how far you would go and how much you would steal when you thought no one was watching, and I was too far gone to notice. And Elise, my brilliant granddaughter, was the only person in this entire greedy family who was smart enough to figure it out and help me track every single penny of the stolen funds you funneled into those offshore accounts." Right at that moment, my mother and father stepped through the broken doorway, pushing past the police officers, eager to witness my supposed downfall. Vivian froze dead in her tracks, her luxury designer handbag slipping from her fingers and crashing loudly to the floor. Harrison stood completely paralyzed, staring in sheer disbelief at his father, who was standing tall and speaking with the wrath of a god. The smug satisfaction of the smear campaign washed entirely from their faces as they realized the trap they had just walked into. Grandpa Langston turned his attention away from the trembling Julian and locked his furious eyes with my father. The look of pure, unadulterated disgust and absolute contempt on his weathered face made Harrison physically shrink backward against the doorframe. "You helped a thief steal my legacy, Harrison," he growled, his voice vibrating with decades of suppressed anger. "You helped him forge my name while I was lying in a hospital bed, and you tried to throw your own innocent daughter to the wolves just to protect his crimes." My father tried to stammer out a pathetic excuse, holding his hands up defensively while sweating profusely. He tried to say he was only protecting the family bloodline and preserving the male heir to the Langston empire because tradition demanded it. He claimed I was just a woman who would marry and give my loyalty to another family anyway. But Grandpa Langston cut him off with a harsh, bitter laugh that silenced the entire room and chilled the blood in my veins. "You sold your soul and destroyed your family to protect a bloodline," Grandpa Langston sneered, taking a slow, deliberate step toward my terrified father. "But the absolute worst part, Harrison, is that you committed federal fraud to protect a boy who is not even your blood." The heavy silence that followed my grandfather's words was violently shattered by the sound of my mother collapsing. Vivian dropped to her knees on the hardwood floor, gasping for air, as if the oxygen had been completely sucked out of the room. Her hands clawed desperately at the collar of her expensive gray dress while she began to hyperventilate. The protective services workers and the armed police officers stood completely frozen, unsure of how to handle the massive family implosion unfolding right in front of them. Savannah backed away from Julian as if he had suddenly caught a contagious disease, her eyes darting frantically between my mother and my grandfather. Julian just stood there, shaking his head back and forth, whispering the word no over and over again like a broken record. Grandpa Langston did not show a single ounce of pity for the woman writhing on the floor. He reached into the inner pocket of his plaid pajama jacket and pulled out a thick folded stack of medical papers. He tossed them onto the glass coffee table where they landed with a heavy, authoritative thud. "Those are the certified results of a discrete genetic test I ordered decades ago," he announced, his voice echoing with absolute power. I have known this since that boy was 5 years old, Vivian. I knew he was the product of your filthy little affair with Marcus Vance, our biggest corporate rival 34 years ago. I kept my mouth shut and buried the truth deep because I wanted to protect the pristine reputation of the Langston family name. I swallowed my pride and allowed another man's bastard to carry my legacy simply to avoid a massive public scandal. My grandfather turned his wheelchair slightly to face my father, who was still leaning heavily against the doorframe, looking like a hollow shell of a man. I kept your wife's disgusting secret, Harrison. My grandfather continued, his tone dripping with pure disappointment. I watched you raise that boy and groom him to take over the empire I built with my bare hands. I stood by and watched you both pamper and worship a child who destroys absolutely everything he touches. You handed him the keys to the kingdom while completely ignoring the one person who actually deserved it. But the ultimate sin, the thing I will never forgive either of you for, is how you treated Elise. Elise, my grandfather stated, his piercing gaze locking onto my parents. You spent decades emotionally torturing and neglecting my true biological grandchild. You treated the only person who actually shares our blood like a worthless outsider. You abused my brilliant granddaughter while pouring millions of dollars of my hard-earned money into covering up the catastrophic failures of a total fraud. I am completely done protecting your lies. Elise was the only one who cared enough to dig into the finances, and she is the only reason I finally decided to stop playing along with your sick little games. The entire room was spinning into absolute chaos. The state workers were quietly backing toward the door, realizing they had been used as pawns in a deeply twisted family cover-up. Savannah was already pulling out her phone, frantically typing messages to her wealthy parents, trying to figure out how to quickly distance herself from the sinking ship that was Julian. Julian himself was completely paralyzed, staring down at the medical documents on the coffee table as his entire identity, his entire inheritance, and his precious male superiority vanished into thin air. He was not the golden child anymore. He was just the dirty little secret my mother had kept hidden for over 3 decades. Without the Langston bloodline, he was nothing but a broke gambling addict facing serious federal charges. But my eyes were glued to my father. Harrison looked like he had been physically gutted by a rusty blade. His chest was heaving and his face had turned a sickly shade of gray. The legendary Langston pride, the toxic obsession with the male heir, the deep-rooted misogyny that fueled his hatred for me. It was all completely shattered in an instant. He had mortgaged his home, he had lied to his investors, and he had thrown his own flesh and blood daughter to the wolves just to protect a son who did not even belong to him. His entire life was a pathetic illusion built on the lies of a cheating wife. He had spent 34 years raising the biological child of his most hated corporate enemy. For one brief, foolish moment, I actually felt a tiny flicker of hope. I watched my father slowly lift his heavy head and turn his eyes toward me. I braced myself, waiting for the realization to finally hit him. I expected him to fall to his knees, right beside my mother, and beg for my forgiveness. I wanted him to tell me he was wrong. I wanted him to look at me, the self-made billionaire who had single-handedly uncovered the embezzlement and saved the family company from total ruin, and finally admit that I was the worthy child all along. I waited for the tears of remorse to fill his eyes. I waited for him to finally love me. But as Harrison locked eyes with me, I did not see a single ounce of regret. I did not see sorrow or apologies or love. I saw pure, unadulterated hatred burning in his dark eyes. The muscles in his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. His hands balled into tight fists at his sides. He did not blame my mother for her betrayal. He did not blame Julian for stealing $50 million. He did not blame himself for being a blind, arrogant fool. He blamed me for turning on the lights and exposing the cockroaches that had been hiding in the dark. If you had just kept your mouth shut, Harrison snarled, his voice vibrating with a terrifying demonic rage. If you had not dug into those financial accounts, none of this would have happened. You ruined this family, Elise. You ruined everything. Before the police officers or my grandfather could even react, my father let out a guttural scream and lunged across the room. His heavy boots pounded against the hardwood floor as he threw his entire body weight directly at me. I barely had time to raise my hands before his thick fingers wrapped violently around my throat, squeezing with lethal force. My vision blurred as the crushing weight of my father pressed me backward against the wall. His thumbs dug deeply into my windpipe, cutting off my air supply instantly. But before the darkness could fully take over, a massive force slammed into him from the side. Grandpa Langston had not come alone. Two enormous men in dark suits, who served as his elite private security detail, had followed him out of the bedroom, and they descended on Harrison with terrifying speed. They ripped my father off me and slammed him violently face first into the hardwood floor. Harrison thrashed and roared like a trapped animal, but the security guards effortlessly pinned his arms behind his back, driving their knees into his shoulders to keep him completely immobilized. I leaned against the wall, gasping for breath and rubbing my bruised throat. The room was ringing with the sound of Harrison shouting obscenities at me from the floor, calling me a traitor and a monster. I looked past him toward my mother, expecting to see at least a flicker of horror that her husband had just attempted to murder her daughter. But Vivian was not even looking at me. She had crawled across the carpet to Julian, wrapping her arms around the trembling, crying grown man, treating him like a fragile victim. She was stroking the hair of the bastard son who had bankrupted them, completely ignoring the daughter who was choking for air just 10 feet away. That was the exact moment the final lingering ghost of my childhood died. Every last drop of desperate hope I had been secretly harboring, the pathetic wish that the truth would finally make them love me, evaporated into the cold air. They would never love me. They would always view me as the enemy who destroyed their beautiful illusion, no matter the truth. I felt a chilling, absolute calmness settle over my entire body. My empathy was gone. It was time for a total and absolute financial execution. I reached into my leather bag and slowly pulled out my digital tablet. The bright screen illuminated my face as I unlocked it and opened the master control interface for my financial technology firm. I looked down at my father, who was still struggling under the weight of the security guards, and then over to my mother and her illegitimate golden child. I gave you chances, I said, my voice steady and devoid of all emotion. Now I take everything. With a single deliberate tap of my finger, I activated my firm hostile takeover protocols. I had spent the last 3 months carefully mapping out every single vulnerability in Julian Logistics' empire. When Julian originally realized his gambling debts were catching up with him, he had panicked and taken out massive leveraged loans to artificially inflate his company value and hide the missing funds. He thought he was dealing with an anonymous private equity group operating out of Delaware. I was too arrogant and too stupid to realize that the private equity group was just a shell company fully owned and operated by my financial firm. I was his primary creditor, and his corporate contracts contained very specific morality and fraud clauses that allowed the lender to demand immediate repayment in full the moment any criminal financial activity was detected. By pressing that button on my tablet, I officially triggered the default clauses. I was calling in a debt of nearly $80 million that Julian absolutely could not pay. Within a matter of seconds, automated systems began legally freezing every single corporate asset tied to his name. His commercial bank accounts were locked. His credit lines were severed. His entire logistics company was instantly forced into corporate liquidation to satisfy the debt he owed directly to my firm. The quiet hum of the apartment was suddenly broken by the sharp ringing of Julian's cell phone. He was still sitting on the floor, staring blankly at the DNA test that had destroyed his royal bloodline. He flinched at the sound of the ringtone, but slowly reached into his pocket and answered it, putting it on speaker out of sheer confusion. The frantic, panicked voice of his senior warehouse manager filled the quiet room. The man was shouting over the sound of blaring sirens and chaotic background noise. He told Julian that a massive fleet of black vehicles had just pulled up to their corporate headquarters. A heavily armed corporate restructuring team, flanked by private security contractors, had just marched into the lobby and demanded everyone pack up their desks. They were physically locking the warehouse managers out of the building, cutting the server feeds, and seizing all company property in real time. Julian dropped the phone. It bounced off the carpet as the manager continued to shout for instructions. Julian stared at his empty hands, trembling uncontrollably. His company was gone. His money was gone. His precious Langston name was a complete fraud. He had absolutely nothing left to his name but massive federal charges and millions of dollars in insurmountable debt. Savannah stood frozen by the window, watching the entire scene unfold with widening eyes. The reality of the situation was crashing down on her like a freight train. She had married Julian specifically for his wealth and his prestigious family pedigree. She had tolerated his arrogance and his gambling because she believed she was securing her place as the future matriarch of the Langston Empire. Now she was standing in a messy apartment, looking at a broke, illegitimate fraud who was about to go to federal prison. Her elite social status was evaporating right before her eyes. The smug, arrogant smile that Savannah always wore completely dissolved into an expression of pure, unhinged panic. She recoiled from Julian, pulling her expensive coat tightly around her shoulders, looking at him as if he were covered in filth. She yanked her cell phone from her purse, her perfectly manicured fingers shaking as she dialed a number. The moment the call connected, her voice echoed through the apartment, frantic and hysterical. Daddy, she screamed into the phone, her breathing heavy and erratic. Crush her company right now. Destroy Elise. The sound of Savannah screaming into her phone echoed off the walls as the security guards dragged my father out of the room. Savannah did not even look at the man she had just married as she stormed out of the apartment, demanding her father fix the massive mess she was in. I knew her father was a ruthless old money billionaire who treated the city like his own personal playground. He had generations of inherited wealth and powerful politicians sitting comfortably in his back pocket. I expected heavy retaliation, but I did not expect it to happen with such terrifying speed. By 8 o'clock the very next morning, the warning sirens in my financial technology firm began blaring. Automated alerts flooded my secure servers, informing me that federal regulators had abruptly frozen all of our primary operating licenses. A targeted federal audit had been triggered overnight, completely paralyzing my entire company. My lead legal counsel called me in a total panic, explaining that orders had come down from the highest political offices in the state, demanding a full-scale, immediate investigation into our operations. The federal agents were already locking down our corporate accounts and threatening to seize our proprietary algorithms. Savannah's father had pulled his heavy strings and unleashed the full weight of the government against me, simply to appease his spoiled, furious daughter. I was sitting alone in my private office later that afternoon, watching the chaotic market fluctuations on my monitors, when the heavy glass doors swung open. Savannah strolled in completely uninvited, wearing a pristine white designer suit and an arrogant smirk that made my blood boil. She looked around my office with an expression of absolute disgust, dripping with the kind of untouchable white privilege that only comes from a lifetime of never facing real consequences. She walked right up to my desk and leaned over, bracing her hands on the polished wood. She told me I was a foolish little girl who thought she could play with the big boys just because I built a successful software application. She laughed a cold, brittle sound and said her family owned the politicians, the judges, and the regulators in this city. She claimed I was completely out of my league and that her father was going to dismantle my firm piece by piece until I was left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back. I sat perfectly still, listening to her delusional rant. Savannah told me there was only one way to stop the federal audit and save my company from total annihilation. She demanded that I surrender the entire Langston estate to her immediately. She stated that since Julian was a broke, illegitimate fraud, I owed her massive financial compensation for the severe public humiliation she had endured by marrying into our ruined family. She wanted the properties, she wanted the remaining liquid assets, and she wanted the corporate holdings transferred directly into her name. She promised that if I signed over all the family wealth to her, she would generously ask her daddy to call off the federal agents and let me keep my little tech company. She tapped her manicured fingernails against my desk, telling me I had no other choice, because my parents would never help me, and my grandfather was too old to fight a massive federal mandate. I looked at her and realized that these people would never stop. They would never love me, they would never respect me, and they would never play fair. The very last shred of empathy I possessed completely died right then and there. It was time for absolute financial execution. I did not say a single word to her at first. I simply stood up from my leather executive chair and walked over to the antique crystal decanter resting on the side table. I poured myself a heavy glass of bourbon, listening to the amber liquid splash against the ice. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the warmth settle in my chest and clear my mind. Savannah stood there, crossing her arms, looking incredibly impatient, waiting for my total surrender. I walked back to my desk and picked up my laptop. I typed in a highly encrypted sequence of access codes and pulled up a hidden restricted database that only I had the authorization to view. I turned the laptop around and pushed it across the smooth surface of the desk so the screen was positioned directly in front of her face. Savannah rolled her eyes, letting out an exaggerated sigh, but she looked down at the glowing screen anyway. Her smug, triumphant expression vanished the exact instant she started reading the digital ledger. I watched the color drain completely from her face as she stared at the endless rows of transaction histories, routing numbers, and offshore account balances. I told her that her father was indeed a very powerful and wealthy man, but he was also incredibly arrogant and unbelievably sloppy. I explained that his entire old money empire was deeply tied to a massive network of illegal shell companies designed specifically to hide illicit funds and evade federal taxes on a global scale. Savannah started to shake her hands, gripping the edge of the desk so hard her knuckles turned white as she scrolled through the damning evidence. I leaned in close, looking her right in those terrified, panicked eyes. I told her that those illegal shell companies processed all of their illicit payments through my financial technology software. Her father thought my encrypted platform was the perfect way to launder his money without detection. I explained that when I dismantled Julian's logistics firm and activated the hostile takeover protocols, I did not just buy his outstanding debt, I bought the actual payment data. I had unfettered access to every single hidden transaction her father had made over the last 5 years, mapped out with perfect, undeniable clarity. I took another sip of my bourbon and casually checked my watch. I told Savannah she had exactly 5 minutes to call her precious daddy and tell him to drop the federal audit immediately. I promised her that if my operating licenses were not fully restored before the clock ran out, I was hitting send and delivering the entire unredacted database straight to the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Savannah stared at the blinking digital timer on my laptop screen, with her mouth hanging wide open in absolute disbelief. The sheer arrogance that usually radiated from her entire being was beginning to severely crack under the intense pressure. She snatched her cell phone from her white designer handbag and frantically dialed her father. Her manicured hands were shaking so violently, she accidentally dropped the phone onto my polished mahogany desk before finally slamming her finger against the speaker button. The booming authoritative voice of her old money billionaire father immediately echoed through my quiet corporate office. Savannah was practically hyperventilating as she begged him to call off the federal audit on my company. She stammered out that I had somehow uncovered his illegal offshore shell companies and was threatening to expose everything. Her father went completely silent for a few long seconds before letting out a loud, booming laugh that filled the room. He told his daughter to calm down and stop acting like a hysterical child. He proudly announced that he had been dodging federal regulators and hiding his massive wealth since before I was even born. He called my threat a pathetic amateur bluff from a desperate woman. He said I was just a bitter little girl who was way out of my league. He insisted that I did not have the courage or the technical capability to take down a man of his immense stature and political influence. I did not flinch or react to his insults. I did not try to argue or defend myself. I just sat back in my leather executive chair and watched the digital timer on my desk click down to the final 0. I looked directly into Savannah's terrified eyes and firmly pressed the enter key on my laptop. The massive encrypted file containing every single illegal transaction routing number and offshore deposit belonging to her father was instantly transmitted directly to the highest levels of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice. Savannah's father was still laughing on the speakerphone, telling me I was going to lose everything I had ever built, and that he would personally ensure I went to prison. I calmly reached across my desk and pressed the button to terminate the call, silencing his arrogant voice forever. We stood in my office in absolute dead silence for exactly 4 agonizing minutes. The air was so thick and heavy it felt hard to breathe. I took a slow sip of my bourbon, watching the panic slowly consume Savannah's features. Then her cell phone started vibrating uncontrollably against the wood surface. The news alerts were pouring in simultaneously from every major financial network in the country. Her screen lit up with bright red breaking news banners, showing live helicopter footage of her father's massive corporate headquarters downtown. Dozens of armed federal agents dressed in dark tactical gear were already swarming the glass building. They were physically smashing through the front doors and carrying out heavy boxes of physical hard drives and paper ledgers. The news anchors were excitedly announcing that a massive coordinated federal raid was currently underway. The Department of Justice had instantly frozen every single asset tied to the family name under federal money laundering and tax evasion statutes. Savannah let out a high-pitched gasp that sounded like a dying animal choking for air. She frantically snatched her phone and opened her elite private banking application. She typed in her password with trembling fingers, desperately trying to access her massive multi-million-dollar trust fund. The screen instantly flashed red with a bold error message stating her accounts were completely locked and under federal jurisdiction. She started hyperventilating, pulling a pristine black luxury credit card from her purse and trying to transfer funds to a secondary offshore account. Access denied. She tried another platinum card. Frozen. She tried a joint account she shared with her mother. Frozen. In a matter of seconds, the arrogant, privileged heiress who had just threatened to crush my company and ruin my life was completely destitute. Her entire family empire had been wiped off the map. She was reduced to a penniless fraud standing in a ruined white designer suit with absolutely nowhere to go. Before she could even process the total and absolute destruction of her privileged life, the heavy glass doors to my office lobby violently swung open. Julian burst into the room sweating profusely and looking completely unhinged. He had been waiting downstairs in his luxury car after his own logistics company was seized and liquidated by my restructuring team. He ran directly toward Savannah, demanding to know what her powerful father was doing to fix this massive disaster. He grabbed her shoulders and begged her to tell him that her family wealth was going to save them from going to federal prison. Savannah slowly looked up at the man she had married strictly for his fake billionaire status and his prestigious last name. Her tear-stained face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She screamed at the top of her lungs that her family was completely ruined, and it was all his fault. Julian froze, completely paralyzed, as the reality of the situation crashed down on him. The wealthy old money safety net he was desperately depending on was gone. The billionaire father-in-law, who was supposed to bail him out, was currently being hunted by federal agents. Julian completely lost his mind. The fake charm and polite high society manners he had used to manipulate people his entire life vanished entirely. He turned on Savannah like a rabid dog, calling her a worthless liability and blaming her corrupt family for dragging him down into the dirt with them. Savannah shrieked an awful sound and lunged forward, slapping him across the face with all her might. Julian grabbed her wrists and pushed her backward into the heavy glass wall. They tore into each other right there in my pristine corporate lobby, screaming horrible obscenities and tearing at each other's expensive clothes. The perfect golden couple of high society was reduced to wild feral animals, clawing and biting each other over the smoking ashes of their fake empires. My private security team immediately stepped forward to separate them and physically restrain Julian, but I held up my hand, instructing my men to stand back. I simply stood by my desk and watched them destroy each other with a cold, detached satisfaction. When they finally collapsed against the floor, panting and disheveled with their clothes torn and their dignity completely erased, I slowly walked out from behind my desk. I was holding a thick manila envelope bearing the official embossed seal of the state. I walked over to the two pathetic figures and dropped the heavy legal document directly into Julian's lap. He stared at it with wide, bloodshot eyes, his chest heaving as he reached out with trembling fingers to open the flap. I told him there was one last piece of business we needed to handle before my security team physically threw them out of my building. I explained that when he originally took out that massive $80 million loan from my anonymous shell company to cover his extensive gambling debts, he needed significant collateral. He needed an asset massive enough to back his fraudulent ambitions and secure the funds. I watched the terrible realization slowly dawn on his bruised face as he read the first page. I informed him that our mother and father were so incredibly desperate to see their golden child succeed that they secretly signed over the deed to the historic Buckhead family mansion. They had used their own home, the very crown jewel of the Langston legacy, as the sole collateral for his debts without telling my grandfather or anyone else. Julian read the final legal foreclosure notice, and his eyes rolled back in sheer terror. I told him that since he had officially defaulted on his loan exactly 1 hour ago, my financial firm had automatically seized the collateral to satisfy the outstanding debt. I looked down at the two miserable frauds cowering on my lobby floor and smiled a cold, genuine smile. I told them that I now personally owned the Buckhead mansion. I slowly checked my watch, tapping the glass face. I told Julian that he and my parents had exactly 1 hour to completely vacate my property before I sent the police to arrest them all for trespassing. Exactly 1 hour later, I pulled my car up to the towering wrought iron gates of the Buckhead family mansion. Right behind me was a fleet of heavy moving trucks and 3 local sheriff cruisers, with their lights flashing silently in the midday sun. I stepped out onto the pristine cobblestone driveway, feeling the warm breeze against my face as the deputies marched up the wide marble steps to officially enforce the eviction. The massive double doors were already wide open. The majestic foyer that had once been the ultimate symbol of the Langston family pride looked like the aftermath of a natural disaster. My parents were frantically running around the grand living room, acting like panicked looters in their own home. Harrison, the man who had always cared so deeply about absolute control and masculine dominance, was currently stuffing antique silver and expensive watches into cheap black plastic garbage bags. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped a crystal decanter, letting it shatter across the imported rug. Vivian was a complete and utter wreck. Her perfectly styled hair was matted to her tear-stained face, and her designer makeup was running down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks. When she saw me walk through the door, flanked by armed law enforcement officers and professional movers, she completely lost her mind. She dropped a handful of diamond necklaces and fell directly onto her knees, crawling across the hardwood floor toward my feet. She grabbed the hem of my pants, sobbing hysterically and begging me to stop. "You cannot do this to us, Elise!" she wailed, her voice cracking with sheer desperation. "Where are we supposed to go? How are we supposed to survive? What will the people at the country club say when they find out we have been thrown out onto the street like common trash?" I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life treating me like a worthless disappointment. I saw the absolute terror in her eyes, but I did not feel a single drop of pity. Her only concern in the face of total ruin was what her wealthy socialite friends would think of her. I did not say a single word to her. I simply pulled my leg free from her desperate grasp and stepped right over her sobbing body. I turned to the lead mover and pointed toward the expensive leather furniture in the sitting room, instructing him to start loading everything into the trucks. The sheriffs were fanning out across the first floor, securing the perimeter and making sure my parents did not try to steal any of the fixtures or heavy artwork that legally belonged to me now. But the chaos downstairs suddenly paused when a loud, violent crash echoed from the second-floor landing. I looked up the grand sweeping staircase and saw one of the deputies backing away from the heavy double doors of the master bedroom suite. Julian had not left the property. Instead, he had sprinted upstairs and completely barricaded himself inside the massive suite. We could hear him screaming through the thick oak doors, his voice completely unhinged and ragged. He was pounding his fists against the wood, roaring that he was the true male heir and that this house was his absolute birthright. He screamed that I was a deceitful thief and that he would rather die than let a woman take his kingdom away from him. But Julian was not alone inside that room. Above his deranged shouting, I could hear the muffled, terrified cries of Savannah. She was sobbing hysterically, begging him to open the door and let her out. She had followed him upstairs to frantically pack her expensive jewelry, and now she was trapped inside a locked room with a man who had just lost his entire grip on reality. The lead sheriff immediately drew his weapon and signaled for his deputies to move up the staircase. He shouted through the door, ordering Julian to unlock the deadbolt and step outside with his hands raised. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, my heart suddenly pounding against my ribs as the situation rapidly spiraled out of control. Julian yelled back that he was not going anywhere and that nobody was taking his property. Then the absolute unthinkable happened. A deafening explosive crack ripped through the air, silencing everyone in the mansion. It was the distinct, terrifying sound of a heavy-caliber gunshot ringing out from directly inside the master bedroom. The bullet blasted through the thick oak door, sending sharp splinters of wood flying out onto the second-floor landing. I froze, completely paralyzed, as Savannah let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed down the hallway. The deputies instantly flattened themselves against the walls, raising their weapons and shouting for backup on their radios. Julian had somehow managed to break into my father's locked gun safe and arm himself with a high-powered hunting rifle. The arrogant broken fraud had just turned a simple corporate eviction into a deadly hostage situation, and he was holding his own terrified wife at gunpoint. The sharp crack of the rifle echoed through the grand foyer, freezing the deputies in their tracks. The lead sheriff immediately grabbed his radio, shouting for emergency backup and a full tactical response unit. Within minutes, the quiet, exclusive streets of Buckhead were transformed into an absolute war zone. Fleet after fleet of armored black vehicles tore up the long cobblestone driveway, tearing through the manicured rose gardens my mother had spent thousands of dollars maintaining. Heavily armed tactical officers poured out of the vans, forming a tight perimeter around the entire estate. The blaring sirens were quickly drowned out by the heavy chopping sound of news helicopters circling directly overhead. Every major local and national news network had picked up the police scanner chatter, and news vans were violently crashing over the expensive iron gates to get the perfect camera angle. I stood safely behind a massive tactical vehicle, watching the live broadcast on a deputy's portable monitor. The immaculate Langston family reputation that my parents had literally sold their souls to protect was currently being broadcast to millions of viewers as a violent, unhinged crime scene. I watched my mother sitting on the curb in the background, weeping hysterically into her ruined hands, while camera crews zoomed in on her absolute despair. Vivian was begging the officers to turn off the cameras, wailing about what her friends at the country club would say when they saw her sitting on the street like a common criminal. Harrison was standing next to her, looking completely defeated, as the authorities pushed him back behind the yellow police tape. The thick glass of the master bedroom window suddenly shattered outward, raining sharp, deadly shards down onto the marble patio below. Julian shoved his face through the jagged opening, gripping the heavy hunting rifle in one hand and twisting his fingers violently into Savannah's blonde hair with the other. He dragged her crying, terrified face right up to the broken ledge so everyone could see her. She was sobbing uncontrollably, mascara running down her cheeks as she begged her powerful father and anyone who would listen to save her. Julian screamed down at the tactical commanders, ignoring their orders to drop the weapon. His voice was completely ragged and raw as he demanded to speak directly to me. He pointed the barrel of the rifle straight down at my chest from the second-floor window, screaming that the house was his birthright. He roared that he was the true male heir, and that he was not going to let some deceitful woman steal his kingdom. He threatened that if I did not legally sign the deed to the mansion back over to him right this second, he was going to pull the trigger. He said Savannah was going to pay the ultimate price for my absolute greed. Savannah managed to pry her face away from the broken glass just enough to look down at me. The arrogant heiress who had strutted into my office just hours ago demanding my total surrender was now a sniveling coward. She was begging me, calling me by my first name, crying out that she was too young to die, and promising she would give me anything I wanted if I just gave him the house. She pleaded with me to be the bigger person and save her life. She promised her father would make me richer than I could ever imagine if I just surrendered the property deed. I stared up at the two pathetic people who had actively tried to destroy my entire existence. I did not feel a single ounce of panic or fear or sympathy. I calmly turned my back on them and walked directly over to the lead tactical commander. He was urgently mapping out the layout of the massive mansion on the hood of his armored vehicle, trying to find a safe entry point. He told me that a direct frontal assault up the main staircase would force a deadly shootout and severely endanger the hostage. He said they needed a blind spot to breach the room without alerting the suspect. I looked down at his crude tactical map and shook my head. I told him I did not negotiate with desperate terrorists, and I certainly did not surrender my hard-earned property to a pathetic fraud. I tapped a specific blank section of his blueprint. I explained that I had spent my miserable childhood locked away in the quiet corners of this massive house, and I had memorized the original architectural blueprints just to find places to hide from my terrible family. I traced my finger along a hidden path behind the walls. I told the commander there was an old forgotten servants' corridor, built a century ago, that ran directly from the basement kitchen straight up behind the walls of the master bedroom suite. It was designed so the staff could clear the fireplace ashes without ever being seen by the masters of the house. The commander looked at me with a grim nod and immediately signaled his primary breach team. He ordered the power grid to the entire estate to be severed, plunging the massive mansion into total darkness to blind Julian and strip away his advantage. As the heavy tactical units silently made their way down into the basement, Julian began screaming in pure panic from the second floor, realizing the lights had been deliberately cut. He frantically searched the dark room for a light source, eventually igniting an antique decorative kerosene lamp that my mother kept on the bedside table. The flickering orange flame cast long, terrifying shadows against the walls as Julian wildly pointed his rifle at the barricaded bedroom door. He had absolutely no idea that the tactical unit was not coming through the door. The heavy oak paneling behind the master bed suddenly exploded inward as the heavily armed officers smashed through the hidden servant entrance. Julian spun around in pure, unadulterated terror, dropping his rifle and stumbling backward over the thick, expensive rugs. His flailing arms violently crashed into the bedside table. The heavy glass kerosene lamp shattered instantly against the hardwood floor, sending a wide, massive wave of highly flammable liquid splashing directly into the heavy cascading velvet curtains. The hungry orange flames ignited with a terrifying roar, instantly crawling up the fabric and setting the entire room completely ablaze. The thick, acrid smoke billowed from the master bedroom windows, blackening the pristine stone facade of the mansion as the fire began to eat through the support beams. I watched from the edge of the lawn, my arms crossed tightly over my chest, as the orange glow reflected in my eyes. It was a surreal sight to see the seat of my family's power slowly being consumed by the very greed and rage that had defined them for decades. The sweltering heat radiated outward, pushing the gathered spectators back as the structural integrity of the roof started to buckle under the intensity of the flames. Savannah was coughing violently, her face smeared with soot and ash, as two tactical officers carried her limp body across the front yard. She was still weeping in a daze, her expensive suit ruined, her spirit completely shattered as the reality of her loss hit her. Julian, however, was a different story entirely. He had waited until the very last second before crawling out of the burning master suite on his hands and knees. He looked like a madman, his clothes singed and his face masked in charcoal. The police had to tackle him to the ground because he was still trying to scramble back toward the inferno. Even as the flames roared hungrily behind him, he was shouting about the heavy iron safe hidden behind the wall paintings. He did not care about Savannah. He did not care that he had almost killed her. He only cared about the vintage Rolex collection stored inside that vault. The officers slapped steel handcuffs onto his wrists and dragged him across the grass while he continued to howl at the sky, claiming the watches were his only remaining ticket to a life of luxury. He looked smaller than he ever had before his ambition reduced to a pile of soot and failed desperate attempts at preservation. My father was standing near the edge of the police line, watching his family history turn to ash. He was livid, his face a deep shade of purple as he pointed a trembling finger directly at me. He blamed me for the catastrophe, screaming that this was entirely my fault. He spat that I had forced their hand by aggressively reclaiming the property, and that I was the one who had burned their precious legacy. I stood my ground and looked him directly in the eyes. I told him that I had not laid a hand on his home, and that the destruction was entirely the work of his beloved golden boy. I said that Julian would rather burn every single Langston asset to the ground than see me rule the empire they had tried so hard to keep from me. Harrison looked like he wanted to jump the line of officers and strike me where I stood, but his anger was quickly replaced by a desperate manic smile. He regained his posture, straightening his jacket despite the smoke stains covering his shirt. He scoffed at me, telling me I was an idiot who did not understand the way the world worked. He informed me that the Langston estate was protected by an elite premium fire insurance policy that had been updated just last month. He boasted that the investigation would show it was an accident, and that they would receive a massive $10 million payout for the total damages of the mansion. He sneered that $10 million was more than enough to rebuild their lives, and that they did not need me or my little tech company to survive. I pulled my phone from my pocket with a slow and steady hand. I watched his smug grin as he prepared to walk away from the ruin of his house. I tapped the screen and opened the digital portal for the insurance provider that held the Langston family's portfolio. I had accessed the policy documents before we had even arrived at the house this morning. The payout clause for the policy was incredibly specific regarding criminal negligence and arson. I scanned the fine print as Harrison watched me with mounting confusion. I informed him that his premium insurance policy was null and void the moment any criminal activity, including arson, was linked to the homeowner or their immediate family. Since Julian was legally married to his daughter and was considered a primary resident of the mansion, his deliberate act of lighting the kerosene lamp meant the insurance company was legally obligated to deny every single penny of the claim. I looked at the policy details and told him he was going to receive $0. I told him that instead of getting a $10 million check, he was now staring at a total loss with millions in demolition and cleanup costs that he was personally liable for as the property owner. The look of absolute horror on his face was the final victory I had been waiting for. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket with a slow and steady hand, watching his smug, arrogant grin as he prepared to walk away from the smoking ruin of his house. I tapped the screen and opened the digital portal for the insurance provider that held the Langston family's entire property portfolio. I had accessed the policy documents before we had even arrived at the mansion this morning. The payout clause for the premium policy was incredibly specific regarding criminal negligence and deliberate arson. I scanned the fine print as Harrison watched me with mounting confusion, replacing his triumphant smirk. I informed him that his premium fire insurance policy was completely null and void the exact moment any criminal activity, including armed standoffs and arson, was linked to the homeowner or their immediate family. Since Julian was legally married to his daughter and was considered a primary resident of the mansion, his deliberate act of starting the fire during a felony meant the insurance company was legally obligated to deny every single penny of the claim. I looked directly into his eyes and told him he was going to receive absolutely $0 and that he was now personally liable for millions in demolition and hazardous waste cleanup costs. The look of absolute horror on his face was the perfect conclusion to the night. By 8 o'clock the next morning, the acrid smell of smoke still clung to my clothes as I pulled my car into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a cheap roadside motel on the absolute worst edge of the city limits. This was the only shelter Harrison and Vivian could afford, with the few crumpled $100 bills they had managed to scrape together from their pockets before the sheriffs threw them off my property. The neon vacancy sign buzzed aggressively above the peeling paint of room number 4, illuminating the filthy concrete walkway. I knocked on the flimsy wooden door and waited, listening to the muffled sounds of daytime television bleeding through the thin walls. Vivian opened the door wearing the exact same soot-stained luxury clothes from yesterday. Her face was hollow and terrifyingly pale as she stared at me and the serious man standing beside me in a sharp gray suit. I pushed past her without waiting for an invitation, stepping into the cramped, gloomy space. The small room smelled overwhelmingly like stale cigarettes and cheap bleach. Harrison was sitting on the edge of a stained floral bedspread, staring vacantly at a small static television broadcasting the morning news. The flashing headline across the bottom of the screen read, "Historic Buckhead Mansion Destroyed in Armed Standoff." I introduced the man beside me as the senior claims adjuster for their premium insurance provider. Harrison stood up immediately, a pathetic glimmer of hope flashing in his bloodshot eyes. He stumbled forward and demanded to know how quickly the $10 million settlement check could be expedited into his personal offshore account so he could start rebuilding his glorious legacy. The adjuster did not even blink at his desperate, arrogant demands. He slowly opened a thick manila folder and pulled out a single sheet of official corporate paper. He informed my father in a cold, bureaucratic tone that the insurance company had completed their preliminary investigation overnight, alongside the local fire marshal and the federal SWAT commander. He stated that the premium policy contained very strict morality and criminal negligence clauses that my family had completely ignored. I explained that because Julian deliberately ignited the fire while actively committing multiple violent felonies, including armed hostage-taking and aggravated assault against law enforcement, the entire policy was completely and permanently voided. Harrison tried to argue, his voice shaking violently, as he claimed he had absolutely nothing to do with Julian's reckless criminal actions. The adjuster simply shook his head and handed him the official denial of claim document. He told my father that as the legal property owner, he was now held entirely responsible for the millions of dollars in hazardous waste cleanup and municipal demolition costs mandated by the city. The insurance company was not going to pay them a single dime. Harrison grabbed his chest and let out a horrible gasping sound, as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the dingy motel room. His knees gave out completely, and he collapsed heavily onto the cheap stained carpet, clutching the formal denial letter like a physical lifeline that had just snapped in half. Vivian dropped to the floor beside him, wailing hysterically, as the absolute reality of their permanent poverty finally crushed the last remaining breath of their lifelong arrogance. They had absolutely nothing left to their names but insurmountable government debt and humiliating public disgrace. I walked out of the motel without saying another word, leaving them sobbing uncontrollably on the dirty floor, and climbed back into my car. The news on the radio was already covering the intense aftermath of the federal raid. Julian had been dragged out of the burning mansion in handcuffs, coughing up thick black smoke and screaming like an absolute madman, while he desperately tried to claw his way back inside to save his precious vintage Rolex collection. He had been formally denied bail by a federal judge who deemed him an extreme flight risk and a highly volatile, violent danger to the community. The former golden boy of the Langston family was currently sitting in a cold concrete cell at the county jail, wearing a bright orange jumpsuit and facing decades in federal prison. Savannah was in an equally pathetic and desperate situation. Her wealthy old money family had completely abandoned her, throwing her to the wolves to save themselves from the sweeping federal indictments I had triggered. Her massive trust funds were permanently frozen, her platinum credit cards were declined at every terminal, and her prestigious high society circle had immediately cast her out into the cold. The arrogant heiress who had aggressively demanded my surrender just 24 hours ago was now hiding in a cheap, overcrowded women's shelter across town, sleeping on a thin cot and eating donated cafeteria food. She had hastily filed for divorce from Julian, hoping to desperately distance herself from his radioactive criminal charges before she ended up behind bars right next to him. I spent the rest of the afternoon at my financial technology firm, overseeing the seamless restoration of my corporate operating licenses. The federal agents had completely cleared my name after verifying the massive mountain of digital evidence I provided against Savannah's corrupt father. I was sitting at my desk watching the market close and feeling a profound sense of absolute peace when my private cell phone started ringing loudly. The caller ID displayed an unknown restricted number, but I answered it anyway. It was Savannah. Her voice sounded incredibly thin and raspy, completely stripped of its usual haughty privilege, but it still carried a desperate, venomous edge. She told me she was not going to let me just walk away with the entire Langston empire while she rotted in a shelter. She claimed she had spent her very last hidden dollars hiring a ruthless, predatory probate attorney who specialized in breaking family trusts. She aggressively informed me that she possessed a highly confidential prenuptial agreement signed by Julian just hours before their lavish wedding. She stated that this legally binding document specifically guaranteed her exactly one-half of the total net worth of my grandfather's vast estate in the event of a divorce. She did not care that Julian was an illegitimate fraud who never possessed royal blood, or that the money rightfully belonged to me all along. She threatened that if I did not immediately wire $5 million to her secure offshore account, she was going to drag me into a brutal public probate court battle and bleed my company dry. I sat in my leather chair listening to the desperate delusions of a ruined woman trying to extort me with forged documents. 3 weeks later, I pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the downtown probate court, feeling completely detached from the pathetic circus that was about to unfold. The massive room was deathly quiet, except for the sound of my footsteps echoing against the marble floor. I took my seat at the polished mahogany table designated for the defense and simply waited. Exactly 5 minutes later, the heavy double doors at the back of the room swung open with a dramatic thud. Savannah strutted down the center aisle looking like she had just stepped out of a high-fashion magazine instead of a crowded women's shelter. She had somehow managed to beg, borrow, or steal enough money to buy a pristine white designer suit and pay for a fresh blowout just for this specific occasion. She walked with that same old arrogant swagger, lifting her chin and refusing to even look in my direction. Walking right beside her was a notoriously slimy defense attorney whose face was plastered on cheap billboards all over the city. He was the kind of desperate lawyer who only took impossible cases hoping for a massive payout. They took their seats across the aisle and Savannah finally turned to look at me. She flashed a venomous, smug grin, acting as if she had already won the ultimate victory and was just waiting to collect her prize. The judge, a stern older man with zero patience for nonsense, took his seat at the high bench and called the hearing to order. Savannah's sleazy attorney immediately stood up and proudly slapped a thick stack of pristine documents onto the table. He puffed out his chest and pompously announced to the court that he possessed a legally binding prenuptial agreement signed by Julian Langston just hours before their lavish wedding. He claimed that the document was completely legitimate and had been personally guaranteed and witnessed by my late grandfather himself. The lawyer stated that the specific terms of this ironclad agreement guaranteed his client exactly one-half of the entire net worth of the Langston family estate in the event of a divorce. He loudly declared that since Savannah had formally filed for divorce due to Julian's violent criminal actions, she was now legally demanding her 50% share of the empire immediately so she could rebuild her life. Savannah sat back in her chair, crossing her legs and staring at me with a victorious smirk. She truly believed she had outsmarted everyone and was about to walk out of this courtroom a multimillionaire. I did not panic. I did not even raise my voice. I calmly stood up from my chair and asked the judge for permission to approach the bench and examine the document myself. The judge gave a curt nod, and I walked over to the stack of papers. I picked up the top page, feeling the crisp, heavy weight of the expensive material. I slowly held the paper up toward the bright fluorescent lights of the ceiling, examining the fibers. The judge watched me with a raised eyebrow, while Savannah let out a loud, dramatic sigh of annoyance, rolling her eyes at my apparent delay tactics. She muttered something under her breath about how I was just a jealous loser trying to prolong the inevitable. I looked directly at her slick attorney and then turned my attention to the judge. I pointed to the faint, translucent watermark pressed deep into the corner of the pages. I explained in a clear, steady voice that this specific brand of luxury paper stock was officially discontinued by the manufacturer back in 2015. The factory had completely burned down, and they never made another batch. Then I slid my finger to the top of the page, pointing directly at the ornate, elegant letterhead featuring the Langston family trust crest. I told the judge that this specific corporate logo did not even exist until 2018. I informed the silent courtroom that I knew this as an absolute, undeniable fact because my own graphic design firm was the exact company that had been hired to create and trademark that logo. I looked straight into Savannah's suddenly panicked eyes and told the judge that she could not possibly have obtained Grandfather Langston's signature on a piece of paper that featured a logo designed years after he had died. I stated with absolute certainty that she had clearly printed this entire forged document yesterday, using stolen obsolete paper from an old filing cabinet she found in the ruins of the house. All the color instantly drained from Savannah's face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out as the crushing weight of her massive mistake finally hit her. Her slimy attorney immediately took 3 steps away from her, physically distancing himself from the blatant forgery he had just presented to a federal judge. He began stammering, throwing his hands up in the air and loudly claiming he had absolutely no idea the documents were fabricated and that his client had lied to him from the very beginning. The judge was absolutely furious. His face turned a deep shade of crimson as he grabbed his heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down onto the sounding block so hard it echoed like a gunshot through the entire room. He shouted that he had absolute zero tolerance for anyone attempting to commit fraud in his courtroom and immediately held Savannah in contempt of court. The judge aggressively signaled the 2 armed bailiffs standing guard by the doors. They marched straight over to Savannah's table, grabbing her arms and twisting them behind her back. They snapped heavy metal handcuffs onto her wrists, right there in the middle of the aisle. Savannah lost her mind. She started screaming wildly, thrashing against the officers and crying hysterically as they loudly read her rights for perjury and attempted grand fraud. Her pristine white designer suit was wrinkled and twisted as they physically dragged her away from the table. She begged the judge to let her go, promising she would rip up the papers and never bother me again, but he completely ignored her pathetic cries. Suddenly, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. Vivian rushed inside, breathless and frantic, having heard the news of the emergency hearing through the local gossip mill. My mother froze in her tracks, watching in absolute horror as her former favorite daughter-in-law was violently dragged down the aisle in handcuffs, weeping like a trapped animal. Vivian frantically lunged across the wooden benches and grabbed my arm with a desperate, clawing grip. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into my skin. Her eyes were wide with pure terror as she begged me to write a check right now to cover Savannah's bail. She pleaded that I could not let the pristine Langston family name be dragged through the mud of a highly publicized criminal trial, and that I had to save their reputation one last time before it was completely destroyed in the public eye. I looked down at the woman who gave birth to me, watching her hyperventilate over the fate of a spoiled, lying thief, instead of caring about the fact that this same woman had just tried to steal my entire future. Vivian was trembling violently, her expensive perfume mixing with the sour scent of her own desperate sweat. She dug her perfectly manicured nails into my arm, as if her sheer willpower could force me to submit to her ridiculous demands. I slowly leaned down until my face was inches from hers, feeling absolutely nothing but cold indifference. I kept my voice entirely flat and devoid of any emotion as I told her that she cared more about a desperate fraud's social reputation than she did about her own biological daughter's life. I pulled my arm free from her frantic, grasping claws and told her to let Savannah rot in a concrete cell where she belonged. Savannah was still kicking and screaming like a feral animal as the armed bailiffs physically dragged her down the center aisle of the courtroom. Her pristine white designer suit was wrinkled and twisted as she thrashed against the heavy metal handcuffs biting into her wrists. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung shut behind her, instantly cutting off her pathetic wails. The judge slammed his gavel one final time, officially dismissing the fraudulent case and ordering a full criminal investigation into the sleazy defense attorney who was already trying to sneak out the back door. I turned and walked out of the courtroom, stepping into the expansive marble lobby of the federal courthouse. The quiet, echoing sound of my heels was suddenly drowned out by a primal, furious roar. Harrison had been waiting outside the heavy doors, having been tipped off by Vivian's panicked text messages. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred, and his eyes were wild with madness. He had completely lost his mind right there in the middle of the federal building. He lunged at me, his hands outstretched like desperate claws, screaming that I had ruined everything, that I was a curse on the Langston family name, and that he was going to kill me with his bare hands. I did not even have time to flinch before 3 massive men in dark tailored suits stepped out from behind the towering marble pillars. They were Grandfather Langston's personal elite security team. They moved with terrifying tactical speed, intercepting Harrison's violent charge and slamming his body forcefully down onto the hard marble floor. The sickening crack of his ribs hitting the solid stone echoed through the massive lobby as the guards pinned his arms tightly behind his back, easily neutralizing his pathetic assault. Harrison thrashed and spat, screaming for them to let him go, but his voice caught in his throat as a soft mechanical whirring sound echoed from the shadowy corridor. A collective gasp rippled through the few bystanders in the lobby as the motorized chair rolled into the bright fluorescent light. It was Grandfather Langston, the patriarch of the family. The man everyone had believed was dead and buried had actually been silently recovering in a highly secure private Swiss medical facility. He had been quietly watching his greedy, unworthy family tear each other apart over his empire from the shadows. He looked frail, but his eyes burned with the exact same intense, terrifying fire that had originally built the Langston legacy. He rolled his chair directly over to where his son was pinned against the cold floor. Harrison started sobbing instantly, completely broken and terrified by the impossible sight of his father. Grandfather Langston looked down at the pathetic, sniveling man who had tried to destroy my life. His voice was a raspy but commanding whisper that demanded absolute silence. He told Harrison that he was officially and permanently disowned from the family dynasty. He ordered him to never so much as look in my direction ever again, or he would personally ensure that Harrison spent the rest of his miserable life rotting in a maximum security prison. Exactly 3 months passed since that explosive day in probate court. The absolute destruction of the former Langston Golden children was completely finalized. Julian had stood before a federal judge, crying like a terrified child, as he was sentenced to 10 consecutive years in a federal penitentiary for armed kidnapping, grand larceny, and arson. There would be absolutely no early parole for the arrogant fraud. Savannah had struck a desperate plea deal to avoid serving jail time alongside him, but it completely ruined her entire existence. She was slapped with massive federal fines that drained every single hidden account she had left to her name. She was essentially deported back to a miserable lower-class existence in a freezing Midwestern state, permanently banned from ever stepping foot in our elite social circles again. Harrison and Vivian had fallen harder and faster than anyone else in the family. Stripped of their prestigious name, their massive inheritance, and their endless luxury, they were violently forced into the brutal reality of the working class. The former masters of the Buckhead Mansion were now working grueling minimum-wage jobs just to afford a cramped, moldy apartment on the absolute worst side of town. I knew this because yesterday I had received a long, pathetic handwritten letter in the mail. The cheap paper was literally stained with dried tears. It was from Vivian and Harrison begging me for absolute forgiveness. They wrote page after page of manipulative garbage saying that they were my parents, that they gave me life, and that I owed it to them to help them survive this nightmare. They pleaded for just a small monthly stipend, a tiny fraction of my immense wealth, so they could buy decent food and turn their heat on during the freezing winter. They tried to use guilt as their final desperate weapon, telling me that blood was thicker than water and that family should always forgive. I folded the pathetic letter and decided it was finally time to give them my ultimate answer. I walked out of my luxury penthouse and climbed into the back of my custom matte black Maybach. I instructed my driver to take me to the rundown Greasy Spoon diner, where my mother now worked the afternoon lunch shift. The massive luxury car smoothly pulled up to the cracked sidewalk outside the filthy glass windows of the cheap diner. I did not bother stepping out of the vehicle. I simply pressed the silver button to roll down my heavily tinted window. Vivian was wiping down a sticky booth in a stained polyester uniform when she saw the expensive car through the glass. She dropped her dirty rag and rushed out the front door, her tired, sunken eyes wide with desperate, frantic hope. She ran right up to my window, gasping for breath, a pathetic, eager smile stretching across her exhausted, aging face. She truly thought I had come to save her. She thought her manipulative crying letter had actually worked on me. I did not say a single word to her. I simply reached into my designer bag and handed her a crisp, white envelope. Vivian snatched it eagerly, tearing it open with trembling hands, fully expecting to find a massive cashier's check that would end her misery. Instead, she pulled out a single itemized invoice. She stared at the paper, her hopeful smile instantly dropping into a mask of pure confusion and absolute dread. It was a bill for exactly $5,000. I looked her dead in the eyes and calmly explained that it was the exact cost of the extravagant Thanksgiving catering she had tried to force me to pay for all those months ago when she first tried to publicly humiliate me. I told her to consider my debt to her completely and permanently paid in full. Before she could even open her mouth to sob or beg, I pressed the button to roll the tinted window back up, cutting off her pathetic voice completely. I tapped the glass partition and told my driver to take me home, leaving the woman who gave birth to me standing on the filthy sidewalk, clutching a worthless piece of paper while my car disappeared down the street. I looked down at the woman who gave birth to me, watching her hyperventilate over the fate of a spoiled, lying thief, instead of caring about the fact that this same woman had just tried to steal my entire future. Vivian was trembling violently, her expensive perfume mixing with the sour scent of her own desperate sweat. She dug her perfectly manicured nails into my arm, as if her sheer willpower could force me to submit to her ridiculous demands. I slowly leaned down until my face was inches from hers, feeling absolutely nothing but cold indifference. I kept my voice entirely flat and devoid of any emotion as I told her that she cared more about a desperate fraud's social reputation than she did about her own biological daughter's life. I pulled my arm free from her frantic grasping claws and told her to let Savannah rot in a concrete cell exactly where she belonged. Vivian let out a hollow, pathetic wail as she watched the bailiffs drag Savannah out of the heavy double doors, her pristine white designer suit completely scuffed and ruined while she screamed hysterically all the way down the hall. I turned my back on my weeping mother and walked out of the courtroom, stepping into the expansive marble lobby of the federal courthouse. The quiet, echoing sound of my heels was suddenly shattered by a furious primal roar. Harrison had been waiting outside the heavy doors, having been tipped off by Vivian's panicked text messages about the emergency hearing. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred, and his eyes were wild with absolute madness. He had completely lost his mind right there in the middle of the federal building. He lunged at me with his hands outstretched like desperate claws, screaming that I had ruined his entire legacy and that he was going to kill me with his bare hands. I did not even have time to flinch before three massive men in dark tailored suits stepped out from behind the towering marble pillars. They were Grandfather Langston's personal elite security team. They moved with terrifying tactical speed, intercepting Harrison's violent charge and slamming his body forcefully down onto the hard marble floor. The sickening thud of his chest hitting the solid stone echoed through the massive lobby as the guards pinned his arms tightly behind his back, easily neutralizing his pathetic assault. Harrison thrashed and spat, screaming for them to let him go, but his voice caught in his throat as a soft mechanical whirring sound echoed from the shadowy corridor. A collective gasp rippled through the few bystanders in the lobby as the motorized chair rolled into the bright fluorescent light. It was Grandfather Langston, the patriarch of the family. The man everyone had believed was too frail to ever leave his private estate was sitting upright and looking down at his pathetic, sniveling son. His voice was a raspy but commanding whisper that demanded absolute silence. He told Harrison that he was officially and permanently disowned from the family dynasty. He ordered him to never so much as look in my direction ever again, or he would personally ensure that Harrison spent the rest of his miserable life rotting in a maximum security prison. Exactly 3 months passed since that explosive day in probate court. The absolute destruction of the former Langston Golden children was completely finalized. Julian had stood before a federal judge, crying like a terrified child, as he was sentenced to 10 consecutive years in a federal penitentiary. Savannah was deported to a miserable lower-class existence in a freezing Midwestern state, facing massive federal fines that drained every single hidden account she had left to her name. Harrison and Vivian had fallen harder and faster than anyone else in the family. Stripped of their prestigious name, their massive inheritance, and their endless luxury, They were violently forced into the brutal reality of the working class. The former masters of the Buckhead Mansion were now working grueling minimum wage jobs just to afford a cramped, moldy apartment on the absolute worst side of town. I knew this because yesterday I had received a long, pathetic handwritten letter in the mail. The cheap paper was literally stained with dried tears. It was from Vivian and Harrison begging me for absolute forgiveness. They wrote page after page of manipulative garbage saying that they were my parents, that they gave me life and that I owed it to them to help them survive this nightmare. They pleaded for just a small monthly stipend, a tiny fraction of my immense wealth, so they could buy decent food and turn their heat on during the freezing winter. They tried to use guilt as their final desperate weapon, telling me that blood was thicker than water and that family should always forgive. I folded the pathetic letter and decided it was finally time to give them my ultimate answer. I walked out of my luxury penthouse and climbed into the back of my custom matte black Maybach. I instructed my driver to take me to the run-down Greasy Spoon diner where my mother now worked the afternoon lunch shift. The massive luxury car smoothly pulled up to the cracked asphalt outside the filthy glass windows of the cheap diner. I did not bother stepping out of the vehicle. I simply pressed the silver button to roll down my heavily tinted window. Vivian was wiping down a sticky booth in a stained polyester uniform when she saw the expensive car through the glass. She dropped her dirty rag and rushed out the front door, her tired, sunken eyes wide with desperate, frantic hope. She ran right up to my window, gasping for breath, a pathetic, eager smile stretching across her exhausted, aging face. She truly thought I had come to save her. She thought her manipulative crying letter had actually worked on me. I did not say a single word to her. I simply reached into my designer bag and handed her a crisp, white envelope. Vivian snatched it eagerly, tearing it open with trembling hands, fully expecting to find a massive cashier's check that would end her misery. Instead, she pulled out a single itemized invoice. She stared at the paper, her hopeful smile instantly dropping into a mask of pure confusion and absolute dread. It was a bill for exactly $5,000. I looked her dead in the eyes and calmly explained that it was the exact cost of the extravagant Thanksgiving catering she had tried to force me to pay for all those months ago when she first tried to publicly humiliate me. I told her to consider my debt to her completely and permanently paid in full. Before she could even open her mouth to sob or beg, I pressed the button to roll the tinted window back up, cutting off her pathetic voice completely. I tapped the glass partition and told my driver to take me home, leaving the woman who gave birth to me standing on the filthy sidewalk, clutching a worthless piece of paper while my car disappeared down the street. Later that evening, I stood on the expansive glass balcony of my newly rebuilt, ultra-modern mansion. I had not restored the old colonial house that burned down. I completely leveled the ashes and built a sleek, stunning fortress of glass and steel that represented my brilliant future and not their toxic past. The massive estate was glowing with warm golden light as I hosted my first massive charity gala. The sweeping halls were filled with the city's most elite philanthropists and business leaders, but this time I was the one sitting at the absolute head of the table. I had officially reopened the family business under my sole ownership. My very first act as CEO was firing every single one of the old toxic board members who had enabled my father's corruption and arrogance. I completely replaced them with a powerhouse team of competent, brilliant Black women who had previously been overlooked and sidelined by the old regime. The energy in the room was electric and pure. I walked through the glittering crowd, feeling a profound sense of absolute peace, until I reached the main terrace, where a special table had been reserved. Grandfather Langston sat there in his wheelchair, looking out over the magnificent estate with a look of pure, unadulterated pride. He raised his crystal glass of iced sweet tea as I approached. He looked right at me with a warm smile and offered a simple toast to the real heir. I smiled back and gently clinked my glass against his. I looked out over the massive crowd, breathing in the cool night air. For my entire life, I had been treated as the scapegoat, the ugly duckling, the college dropout, and the ultimate family disappointment. But they were all gone now, buried by their own greed and arrogance. I was the queen now. The empire was entirely mine, and it was completely untouchable. The night faded to black as the music swelled, leaving the past exactly where it belonged. The greatest lesson from this entire ordeal is that true family is not defined by blood or obligation, but by mutual respect and unwavering support. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you need protection from. Building your own empire means having the courage to burn down the toxic expectations placed upon you and refusing to apologize for your own brilliance. When you finally stop trying to earn the love of people who are committed to misunderstanding you, you create the space to find the people who truly value your worth. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your own peace and build your own future? Share your story in the comments below.